Alright, so assalamu alaikum guys. Let's see, someone has entered. Alright, so for you, we're gonna go ahead and begin. Alright. So let's see if Yusuf's message. Alright, just Anas, just send Yusuf a message.
Oh,
I sent him the link also.
I did.
Okay. Alright. Alright, so let's go ahead and begin. Alright, so in this lesson there's not a whole lot of information. I think the next one is gonna be a little bit longer, right? So this one is
Whether you're lagging.
lagging. Alright. Is it working now? Alright. Anas, is it working?
Brother, you're lagging.
Alright. Freya, is it working over there?
Yeah, I can't understand you.
Okay.
He froze.
Alright. Alright, so we're going to talk about ATP. Alright, Anas, is it working?
Yes.
Alright, so we're going to talk about ATP today. Alright, so so this molecule, right? This is an important molecule, right? So this molecule is basically how the cell, uses energy, or how the cell, you know, this is basically like the energy molecule that the the cell uses. This is basically the energy molecule that the cell uses in order to power everything in the cell, right? So this is called ATP, right? So in this molecule, right, is composed of three different things, right? You see over here on the left, this is called adenine, right? So does this look familiar to anyone, right? So you see this over here, Freya, adenine, right? Where have you seen
What you
something like?
say, brother? You lagged.
I'm saying this.
You
You,
froze.
you see this like teal kind of color, right? It's called adenine, right? Where have you seen something like this before? Yeah, that structure in water, hydrogen bonds, right? How about Anas? Where have you seen this before? Adenine.
Like, what do you call it? When people are in the hospital, they add like Adderall in their body.
Do you guys remember we were talking about DNA and RNA before, right? Like nucleic acids.
I wasn't here last class. I missed it.
Right, Anas, was the password the password was working, right? The one I sent you.
It was Yahya, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah,
All caps.
in capitals, right?
YAHYA. But are you lagging or am I lagging?
I'm not sure. I don't see you lagging. All right, I think Yusuf is gonna try one more time. All right. All right, Yusuf. I mean Anas. All right, so I'm gonna. All right, so we'll keep going for right now. All right, so in ATP, right, you see this adenine, right? This is what we were talking about when we were talking about nucleic acids. Do you guys remember like DNA and RNA, right? Right. So do you remember these like hexagon and pentagon kind of structures put together, right? So this was one of those parts of a nucleic acid nucleotide, right? So that's where this comes from. And then what is this down here? This is like a sugar, right? Do you guys remember the sugar and then the phosphate group, right? Do you guys remember when we were talking about the nucleic acids? It consisted of what? One base, nitrogenous base like adenine, one ribose sugar, right? You see it's like pentagon kind of structure. This is a sugar, and then one phosphate group, right? Now the difference is in this one you have three phosphate groups. You see this? You have three of them. One, two, three, right? So this thing right here is called ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, right? So triphosphate meaning three phosphate groups, right? So three phosphate groups. So here's basically what happens, right? You see this one at the bottom? This basically kind of tells you what happened. So when you break each one of those phosphate bonds, right? Like if I go over here and I break it right over here, I break the bond right over here between these two phosphate groups, between these two circles, then when that breaks, that releases like a whole bunch of energy, right? So that basically releases like a whole bunch of energy, and the cell uses that to power something in the cell. It's like this: if you have like if you have like a rubber band like stretched across, right? Let's say you have some kind of like rubber band like stretched across, and then right, so you're holding it like that, and then at one end you suddenly let it go, right? So at one end you suddenly let it go, and so as the stretched rubber band goes back, you can use it to do work, right? Because now it's like pulling one end towards the other, right? So that's kind of the idea over here. When you break the bond, right, that releases energy and that produces work. So you can see down here on this bottom picture, right, you have the three phosphate groups over here, right, 1, 2, 3. But when one of them is broken, that last one you see when is broken and goes off by itself, that releases energy in the process. All right. Any questions about this one so far? No. All right. So let's take a look at where all this happens. All right. So here's kind of like an overview of what happens, and we're going to talk a little bit in detail about this next time, right? But where does ATP come from, right? It comes from when you burn something like glucose, right, which is sugar, or you burn some fat, or you burn some protein, right? Whatever the cell is using for energy, when it kind of burns that, it produces ATP. So this picture right over here is giving you an example of what happens when you burn glucose. All right. So let me ask you a question. So Freya, what kind of molecule is glucose? It's a sugar, right? So this is called a monosaccharide. Right? So this is a sugar, glucose, right? So when glucose is burned, over time, it produces, a total of 38 molecules of ATP, right? So do you guys notice like this this big yellowish structure over here, right? So Anas, what is this big yellowish kind of structure over here?
It's it's like the cell,
Mhm.
which like keeps everything in.
It's part of the cell, right? Freya, what do you think is this big yellowish thing over here on the right? So it says here mitochondria, right? Do you guys remember what mitochondria is? And what is the mitochondria? Right, that's basically what energy is produced, right? So so what this picture is telling you is like where these different processes are occurring, right? So you see this stuff outside, um, this green blue kind of color, right? Right. This is like outside in the cytosol, in the cytoplasm, right? So this is just kind of like floating around in the cytosol. So some of this reaction, when glucose is turned into energy, occurs in the cytosol, outside of the nucleus or mitochondria or anything like that. But then most of the energy is produced in the mitochondria. You see this, right? So outside, right, is how much? Like about 2 ATPs, right? For every one molecule of glucose, of this sugar, 2 ATPs are produced outside. But most of it, you see about 36, right? 2 plus 34, about 36 is produced inside the mitochondria. You guys see this here, right? Right. So there's basically 3 different parts. One is called glycolysis, where we produce 2. You have this thing called the citric acid cycle, which also produces 2. And then you have this thing called oxidative phosphorylation, where we produce 34. So this last portion, that's like the most important part, where That's like the most important part, where the most amount of energy is produced. All right. So this portion over here is kind of showing you the last portion of this process, right? Remember we were talking about up here, right? Oxidative phosphorylation, right? This last portion in the purple, all the way to the right. So this picture over here is showing you that last kind of process, right? So here's basically what kind of happens, right? There's this kind of you see this blue machine, right? As these hydrogen ions, these H pluses, as they flow through, right? As they're like flowing all the way through, it kind of turns this kind of machine that turns ADP into ATP, right? So you know like let's suppose you have like a windmill, like a water mill, right? As water flows down the river, right? As water flows down the river, it like turns a big wheel, right? It kind of like turns a big wheel, and that wheel turning like does some kind of work, like it grinds wheat into flour, or corn into cornmeal, or something like that, right? So this is the same kind of idea. You can kind of imagine like there's like a whole bunch of these hydrogen ions out here, and then when they kind of flow back down through this, it kind of like sort of turns this kind of wheel-like thing, and then what happens is that ATP is produced. All right. So Freya, take a look at this diagram right over here. It says ADP plus this phosphate group turns into ATP. So can you kind of explain like what's happening right over here, right? Kind of like what exactly is happening right over here? Mm-hmm.
That was tough, brother. That was tough. That was really tough, brother.
Right, right. So you see over here, right? Let's this reaction down here, ADP going to ATP, right? Let's look at it a little bit closer on the next picture, right? So this is called the ATP ADP cycle, right? So Anas, what is the difference between ATP and ADP? Right, so Anas, what is kind of the difference?
Brother, you're lagging for me.
All right, Yusuf, are you here? Is it working now?
I hear you.
You here? Okay. All right. So tell me, Anas, what is the difference between ATP and ADP? Right. What is like
Wait,
the
brother, I missed like half the lesson, brother.
okay? So we'll review. So there actually wasn't like too much material. So we'll go back and review because this lesson's a little bit shorter, anyways. Right.
All right.
So we're looking at ATP, right, which is like the energy molecule that produces energy, right? And ADP, right? So what is the difference? ATP and ADP. How does ATP become ADP?
I have
Like what is it?
oh, okay, yeah. So it loses one phosphate.
Right. So ATP has 3 phosphates, right?
Yeah.
So when one of these breaks off, that's what results in a whole lot of energy being produced.
It becomes a diphosphate.
Right? It becomes diphosphate, right? So this one over here is ADP, right? Now, what you need to do is eventually you need to turn ADP back into ATP, right? So the cell does this from energy that is produced from food, right? So ADP eventually gets turned back into ATP, and then ATP goes all over the cell and does work by cutting off one of its phosphate groups. So when that bond is cut, that releases a whole bunch of energy, and that's used to do work in the cell. All right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Only 2. Right. All right. So this is kind of showing you something kind of similar, right? So this picture right over here is showing ATP turning into ADP, right?
What is brother? But what is ADP?
So ADP also can be used to produce energy, but it's basically kind of like an intermediate, right? ATP is the main energy molecule in the cell, right? But like So like its byproduct is ADP. So ADP has to be
Oh.
turned back into ATP and like kind of
Oh,
recycled
okay.
in the
So
cell.
ATP is like it's like ADP is a result of like chemical reaction or nuclear reaction or whatever.
Right, it's the result of the reaction, right?
All right.
All right. So what's happening in this picture, right? So in the yellow, what Freeha, what is this? What is this thing in the yellow? One water molecule, right? So it's showing how does ATP break apart. So how does it happen? Is that this water kind of breaks apart and attaches to the two parts of the resulting molecules, right? So remember, these two were joined together. These ones on the right used to be joined together, but now they've broken apart, and one of the hydrogens from the water is over here, and the other hydrogen and the oxygen is over here on the other side, right? So this process, right, where you use water to break apart a molecule, this is called hydrolysis, right? So hydro means like kind of like water, right? And then lysis means to break something apart. So this thing right here is called hydrolysis. This is like the process by which ATP breaks apart and turns into ADP and a phosphate group, right? So when this happens, that's where the energy is released, and the cell uses that energy to do some kind of work. All right. All right. So now this diagram is just kind of telling you the different notations, right? So when you have all three of the phosphate groups, right? Right, Anas, what is that called when you have all three of the phosphate groups together? Anas, are you there? All right. So what is it called when you have, all three of the phosphate groups put together?
Hey, Anas. What?
I think his internet is not working very well. All right, Yusuf, what do you think? When you have all three
It's
put
called
together,
it's called triphosphate. Brother.
triphosphate, right? What if you have two left?
Diphosphate.
And Fariha, what if you have only one left?
Diphosphate.
Mono, right? So you see ATP, ADP, and AMP, right? You see, right? So each phosphate that you have, AM, mono, di, tri. You guys understand? All right.
Mhm.
And of course, remember this one over here is the ribose sugar, right? Just like you have in RNA. And this over here is adenine, right? Yusuf, do you remember where we've seen adenine before? Like this kind of
Yes.
structure? Where have we seen this before?
Brother, it's one of the four chain things inside the DNA. I forgot what
Right.
it is. Though. It's a protein or
one of
something. I
the
guess. I
four
don't know what it is.
nitrogenous bases, right? So
Hmm.
this thing here is basically like a nucleotide, except it has a couple extra phosphate groups, right? Like in DNA and RNA, you just have this one phosphate group over here.
Wait, but how do you know it's a phosphate group, brother? Like, where is the phosphate group in adenine?
Okay. Not in adenine. I mean out here. You see over here on the left.
Yeah.
You see. this
Okay. Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
you see
Those
it?
I see.
Yeah. So these are all the right. So the whole structure, right? What's different about it is that it has three phosphate groups. The ones in DNA, right? This is just one phosphate group.
So what is this structure, brother? I don't understand. What is it? This is ATP.
This is ATP.
I see. So ATPs consists of adenosine, which is adenine, and ribose.
Right. So
Right?
So this thing is kind of like a nucleotide,
Hmm.
right? That we talked about for DNA and RNA, right? So this is kind of similar, except it has
So
yeah.
no, go. Whatever you say.
So it's similar, except it's got these two extra phosphate groups, and these are the bonds that when you break them produce a lot of energy.
So AMP, ADP, and ATP have have the same thing. They're all like they all have this base where it's like adenine and ribose,
Mhm.
and then they just differ from how many phosphate groups they have, right?
Correct. That's the difference.
I see.
All right. So let's take a look over here, right? So this is kind of telling you the same kind of thing, right? So saying water molecules and a small amount of energy are needed to remove a phosphate from ATP, right? So we talked about the hydrolysis, right? You put a water molecule and it breaks it apart. You also need to insert like a little bit of energy, right? However, you get like a lot more energy out of it than you put in to break the bond. So to break the bond, you gotta use a little energy. It's like this. Imagine if you stretched a rubber band, right? Right. You stretch a rubber band, right? That's like a lot of potential energy because that's like tight, right? Now,
Mhm.
if you take a knife and you just kind of cut it a little bit in the middle, right? That
Mhm.
requires a little bit of energy, right? You got to put in a little bit of energy.
Mhm.
But that takes just a little bit of energy, and when you break it, that rubber band, kind of like snapping apart, that's going to produce a lot more energy than what you put in, right? You guys kind of understand the analogy, right?
Yeah,
So,
brother, I see,
so
brother.
when you do that, right, it's like you're putting in a little bit of energy, but overall, the amount you're gaining is a lot more. You understand? All right.
Mhm.
So when you break that bond, you produce energy. All right. So it says here that energy is used by the cell to do all kinds of things, right? To move, for transport of things in and out of the cell, for protein synthesis, for making cells, right? So all kinds of things, like pretty much everything in the cell that needs energy uses this process, ATP to ADP. All right. Now, uh, so ATP, however, is not very stable, right? So you're not going to
Mhm.
like store energy in the body using ATP, right? You're going to store it in carbohydrates, fats, other things like that, right? So those are
Mhm.
storage molecules. But then, as soon as you need the energy, then in that time, it's broken down and ATP is produced, right? So ATP is not really like a long-term storage. It's not very stable for long-term storage. It's just quick energy right there in the moment. So when you need that energy, then you have to go get the glucose or the fat and break that down and turn that into ATP first.
Mhm.
All right.
Oh, so it doesn't directly become energy. You break it down so it becomes ATP, and then the ATP
Right.
converts into
Correct.
energy.
Right. So sugar itself has to be turned into ATP first. It has to be used
Mm.
to produce ATP first. Right. All right. So for long-term storage, you need other kinds of things. You need sugar, starches like potatoes, right? You need fats, right, like in fat cells, right? So all of these kinds of things, right, are long-term storage molecules, right? So um, let's suppose you have like some excess energy, right? You have excess energy in the cell, then you're going to turn the ATP, the energy of ATP, back into these molecules for long-term storage. Then when you need them again, then you're going to turn them into ATP again, right? So everybody can understand that process, right? Now this one over here is just kind of telling you that in different kinds of foods, right, you get different amounts of energy, right? So Yusuf, which is the most efficient form of energy storage?
From fats, brother, it says
Mm-hmm.
9 calories per gram.
Fats, right? So if you have a gram of fat,
Mm.
then you get like 9 calories. So you get more than twice from the other sources. So if you were to store all your energy in terms of carbohydrates, like starch or
Mhm.
sugar or something like that, then a
Mhm.
person would be like a lot bigger than they are, right?
Mhm.
So fat takes up like less space, right?
But stores more energy.
But stores more energy, right?
But so that's why people who do intermittent fasting and stuff, where they don't eat
Mm-hmm.
and they run and exercise and stuff, is because they want to burn that fat, right?
Right. They want to
To
burn that
enter
fat.
energy.
Right. Correct.
Ah, I
Right.
see.
All right. So let's go back. Let's go back to the beginning, and we'll just do like a quick overview. I think there was like a whole lot of new stuff in the beginning, but this is the basic idea, right? So you have ATP, right? ATP is an
Mhm.
energy molecule, right? So when you
Mhm.
cut off that last phosphate, that's where that energy is produced from
The
ATP.
immediate source of energy, the drug. Okay. Oh, so basically, it's made of adenine.
Mhm.
Yeah, see that this is what I was asking. A 5 carbon sugar called ribose.
Right.
What is that? Where is that,
So you
brother? I
see,
don't
it's
see
in
no.
the green. You see this in the
Uh,
green? That's the
oh,
ribose
okay.
sugar right there. Right.
Okay, so that's the ribose. Oh, yeah, because it has hexagonal. I
Right.
mean,
You guys,
pentagon
right.
form, right?
So like in DNA or RNA, right?
Mm-hmm.
Ribonucleic acid,
Yeah,
deoxyribo,
ribonucleic.
right? So like
So, brother,
ribose.
the pentagon shaped thing,
Mm-hmm.
is it a carbohydrate then?
That is a carbohydrate, right? That's a
All right.
monosaccharide. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's adenine and then 5 carbon sugar and then you have a
Right.
chain of 3 phosphate
Right.
groups.
So when
I
you
see.
break that off, that's what produces a lot of energy for the cell to use. Right.
I see.
Now, most of the energy. This is giving an example. Like if you take glucose, a sugar, and break it down into ATP, what it's
By the
showing you.
way,
Just a second. So
I think Anas got kicked, brother.
yeah, I think he was saying his
Anyways.
internet is in and out or something like that. So I guess
Mm,
he's gonna try to log back in.
all right.
So when glucose gets turned into ATP, total you form about like if it's working at maximum efficiency, about 38 molecules right here. So about
38 molecules of what?
of ATP. So each
Oh,
molecule of
of 18.
glucose produces 38 molecules of ATP.
Well, it says 34. Oh, okay. Two
So
from the substrate
right,
level, two from the
right.
substrate
So
level.
so there's three different parts. Outside
Mm,
in the cytoplasm, you produce two
mm,
from this thing called
mm,
glycolysis.
uh-huh,
Inside, through this thing called the citric acid cycle, you produce
mm,
another two.
mm.
And then the last portion, oxidative phosphorylation, that part produces 34. Right.
Oxidative phosphorylation,
Right.
electron transport, and
So we're
chemiosmosis,
going to
brother.
talk a little bit more about this next lesson, right? But these last two
Right.
things, they occur in the
Mhm.
mitochondria,
I
right?
see.
Right.
Alright.
Whereas this thing occurs outside
Okay, so
in
this is
the
the
cytosol.
glycolysis we were talking about, where
Mhm.
the water dissolves the mitochondria or something like that, right?
Close. That's I was talking about hydrolysis,
Oh, okay, this is glycolysis
right?
hydrolysis. So what does hydrolysis do? Hydrolysis
So
dissolves the mitochondria?
so hydrolysis means you're breaking something apart using water,
Mhm.
right? So it's breaking something apart
So
using water.
so like breaking so that what does the so then in the process of hydrolysis, how does it create ATP? Just breaks
Yeah.
what does it break down? That's what
Yeah,
I'm
okay. Yeah.
asking.
So let's go to that picture, right? So first of all,
All right.
this right here, right? This
Mhm.
right here is showing oxidative phosphorylation, that last step. So it's showing that you see this blue protein. This is basically
Yeah,
like a place where ATP.
transport protein or
Yeah, right,
one of
right.
those like channel proteins,
Yeah,
right?
it's
Yeah.
kind of like a channel protein. But when the hydrogen, you see this H, these are moving through,
Hydrogen, yes.
right? When it's moving through, it produces work. Just like water flowing down a river and turning like a water wheel.
Oh, all
Okay.
right, I see.
So when it turns
Mhm.
down, ADP, right? That was like the
Mhm.
byproduct, turns back into ATP.
Oh, all
See
right.
that?
So
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 you're
the hydrogen coming through the thing produces energy, and that causes the ADP to turn into ATP.
ATP, right? So this happens
I
in the
see.
mitochondria, right?
Mm.
Right. Now we were talking about hydrolysis, right? Or, okay. So this again
Wait,
is
wait, brother, can you go back to the third slide just quickly, like just for 1 second?
this one.
So, all right. So this is the process, right? It says
Mm-hmm.
two hydrogen molecules, and then you have two electrons, and then they plus an oxygen molecule that creates H2O, and then
Right.
times two, right? So the H2O converts this ADP to ATP, right? Then.
Uh, this is a little bit different. So there's multiple things going on here. So this
Mm,
water that's being produced, that's not
mm.
that has nothing to do with hydrolysis. So
All right.
yeah. So that's like this chain right here, electron transport chain. That's like a whole other thing we got to talk about.
Oh, all right, all right. I see, brother.
So this right here, right? This is just kind of showing you again ATP and ADP. They're cycling back and forth, right?
Mm,
So
yeah.
ATP turns into ADP, really produces energy, right?
Mm.
ADP then eventually it's got to be turned back into ATP, right?
Uh,
Through that turning thing that we saw in the slide
so
before.
ADP so basically ADP never disappears, or ATP, whatever, it never disappears,
Right,
right?
it gets regenerated, right? So these molecules are kind of recycled back and forth.
Okay, so then if it's never done, then we keep eating, brother, right? So
So
that means we get more ATP in our
so
bodies,
I, I,
and
th- I
then it
think
converts to ADP and
so I
ATP
think
and
it's, I
just
think
keeps
it's like
going.
different things. So eventually, like any molecule in the cell eventually gets damaged. Like for example, if you have
Oh.
proteins in the cell, right?
Uh,
Proteins in the cell membrane, right? You would
mm.
think, oh well, I don't never have to make proteins again. When it was like things get damaged and stuff like that, and they have to be taken out.
All right. So the cell throws them out, like
Yeah,
for
the cell
homeostasis
throws
or
them
whatever,
out,
too,
stuff like that,
in a way.
right?
All right, I
Right.
see.
So that's one thing, right? Now another thing is so ADP, right? You see, these are
Mhm.
two phosphate groups. You might ask, okay, well, how come I don't break apart this phosphate to turn it into AMP, right? Isn't that going to give me more
Yeah.
energy?
Hmm.
So you can do that as well. I think sometimes it does, but that process doesn't produce as much energy as breaking off this first phosphate group. Does that make sense?
So then, when does AMP come into existence,
I
brother?
think I don't
Like
remember.
when is it?
Yeah. So that's a good question. So I don't remember exactly. There are some places in the cell where it does that. ADP turns into AMP. Um,
Oh, I see.
but generally speaking, it doesn't because that doesn't produce as much energy as this
As much
first.
energy.
Yeah,
Right?
as this first phosphate being cut off does. Right.
Mhm.
So this was the hydrolysis we were talking about, right? So ATP being broken into ADP. Do you see the yellow portion, right? You see in the yellow on the
Mhm.
left and in the right. That water
Yeah.
molecule was used to break this thing apart.
Wait, so that's the phosphate group, right? So
Right.
the water molecule was used to break one phosphate group apart.
To break one phosphate group off, right? Right.
Oh,
So this
I
water
see.
was used to break this one phosphate group apart, and so that now this phosphate group is now by itself, right? And you see the
Oh.
yellow, the H2O,
Mhm.
that kind of has formed
One hydrogen, only one oxygen now,
yeah,
right?
right. So that hydrogen and those oxygens, those hydrogens and oxygens, they've
Mhm.
become part of the ADP and phosphate molecules. So the
Mm.
water was broken apart in
The
order to
water was
break
broken
these
apart.
two things apart.
Right,
Right?
right.
So this thing is called hydrolysis. Hydro
Mm.
meaning water, lysis meaning break apart.
Breaking apart, right,
Right.
right.
So this again was the different types of things: AMP, ADP, and ATP.
And
Right,
ATP.
depending on how many phosphate groups you have. Right.
Mhm.
And then we're talking about long-term energy storage, right? So ATP, right, is very unstable. So you got to turn it
Mhm.
into fats and starches and other kinds of things in order to store it long
Yeah.
term, right?
Uh-huh.
And then, of course, fats produce the most amount of calories, the most amount of energy per gram.
Mhm.
All right. All right. Any last questions for Reha? You have any questions? Any questions? All right. Yusuf, any questions?
No.
Questions? All right. So let's go ahead and
So-
begin with the quiz.